"Don't cry, miss. You can borrow my dad." The little girl's voice echoed in front of the CEO, who sat alone at Loring Park on Christmas Eve. Snow had begun to fall softly that afternoon, each flake drifting down onto the quiet park like a thin layer of dust settling over memories time had long forgotten. Only 1 week remained until Christmas, and all of Minneapolis was glowing with holiday cheer. Windows flickered in red and green. Carols floated out from distant shops, as if the whole city were trying to wrap its arms around itself for warmth. But here, beside the frozen lake, where children had once skated with carefree laughter years ago, everything was unbearably still. Audrey Whitestone sat alone on the cold iron bench. Her gray wool coat was buttoned all the way up to her neck. A cashmere scarf was wrapped neatly, the way someone who always had to maintain a flawless appearance would wear it. Even the leather gloves on her hands couldn't stop the cold from seeping into every knuckle. Next to her lay a gift box, carefully wrapped in silver paper and tied with a white ribbon. A gift from the board of directors, a luxurious watch marking 10 years of service. Something that should have been a symbol of pride. But it warmed nothing. Her eyes were red, though she wasn't crying. She didn't cry anymore. Not since she was 9 years old, sitting in an orphanage on Christmas Eve, waiting for someone, anyone, to choose her. But no one did. Too small, the social worker had said, not cruelly, just plainly, like stating an unavoidable fact. Too fragile. So she stopped waiting. And years later, even after she built everything with her own hands, her tech empire, her penthouse, the admiration of an entire industry, she still couldn't stop herself from returning to the image of the little girl on that stone bench, quietly hoping for a miracle that would never come. This year, the feeling was even worse, as if her success had grown too big, too loud, while she herself had become smaller inside the shadow of it. If you're watching this far, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this story. And what sent a chill down my spine was, who exactly was that little girl? And why did that innocent sentence strike straight into the wound Audrey had spent her entire life trying to bury? A laugh rang out somewhere in the park. Audrey lifted her head slightly. On the snow-covered path, 2 figures were walking slowly. A man in a thick flannel coat, his slightly wavy brown hair tousled under a knit beanie. Beside him was a little girl in a puffy winter jacket, wearing a hat with 2 tiny bare ears. She clutched a paper bag, its sides creased with oil stains and the faint warmth still lingering inside. They stopped near a bench across from Audrey. The man bent down, pulled out carefully wrapped cookies, and gently handed them to another man who was huddled beneath a torn blanket. He smiled, said something soft, something barely audible, and then they continued walking. Audrey lowered her gaze to the gift box beside her. Still unopened, still meaningless. "Daddy." She looked sad. The little girl's voice was soft, curious. Audrey looked up and saw her staring, a tiny gloved hand tugging lightly at her father's coat. He followed her gaze, and hesitation flickered across his face. He whispered something to his daughter and tried to guide her away gently. But the little girl slipped from his grasp with surprising grace. She walked toward Audrey, her small boots crunched on the snow. She tilted her head, looking up as if trying to read something written on the face of the woman sitting alone in the cold. "Don't cry, miss," the little girl said. "You can borrow my dad." The words hit Audrey like a gust of wind straight to her chest. Sudden, pure, impossible to brace for. She stared at the girl, stunned, unsure how to respond. She couldn't even remember the last time someone had spoken to her like that. Not from pity, not out of politeness, not to impress, just simply noticing. The man hurried over, his cheeks flushed from both cold and embarrassment. "I'm so sorry. She's very friendly." But he didn't pull the girl away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, took out a cookie wrapped in parchment, and offered it to Audrey with a shy, uncertain smile. "Merry Christmas," he said. "It might be sweeter than necessary, kind of like holly." Audrey looked at him. This time, she really looked. His eyes were tired but kind. His hands, slightly red from the cold, held the cookie as if offering something valuable. His voice carried no pity, no awkward hesitation, only a natural, gentle warmth. She reached out to take the cookie and nodded. Her fingertips brushed his, just barely. They trembled, and not from the cold. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, then turned to lead Holly away. But the little girl lingered, waving as if they had known each other for a very long time. "My dad is very nice," Holly said, her smile shining like one of the rare lights that pierce a winter night. "You'll feel better if you finish the cookie." Then the father and daughter disappeared down the snowy path. Holly's voice floated back through the dark, chattering about gingerbread and Christmas lights. Audrey remained still. The cookie lay in her hand. It was heavier than the gift box, and far more real. Ryan was getting ready to take Holly home when a voice called from behind. Gentle, uncertain. "Is there anywhere nearby? I mean, somewhere I could buy you both a hot chocolate?" He turned. Audrey was standing where they had just walked away from. The cookie, half-eaten, rested in her gloved hand. The gift box tucked under her arm. Her expression was difficult to read, hesitant, guarded, almost shy. Ryan hesitated, but before he could answer, Holly lit up as if this was the question she had been waiting her whole life to respond to. "Yes, miss. There's a very cozy cafe right near the Walker Art Center." The cafe was tucked behind a bookstore and a flower shop. Warm yellow light spilled from its windows, the glass foggy from the heat inside. A slightly crooked wreath hung above the door. Through the window, shelves of pastries and rows of cinnamon sticks lined the counter, neat and inviting. They stepped in. The scent of cloves, cocoa, and pine wrapped around them like a soft scarf. Holly darted to a corner table near a small fireplace, as if afraid the warmth would disappear if she didn't claim it quickly. Ryan and Audrey followed more slowly. They sat down. Audrey across from Ryan, Holly next to her father. The fire crackled steadily beside them. Outside, snow continued to fall, quiet as a whispered lullaby. Holly leaned forward, so excited she nearly forgot to breathe. "We have a Christmas tree at home. It's only 1 meter tall, but it has real candy canes, and I made the star from cardboard and glitter." "That sounds magical," Audrey said softly. Ryan smiled, opened his bag, and took out a silver thermos. "I usually bring this for Holly after we finish giving out cookies around the neighborhood." He poured thick, steaming hot chocolate into 2 paper cups. One for Holly. The other he handed to Audrey. She accepted it. Her fingertips brushed his again. "It's been a long time since anyone poured something warm for me." Ryan didn't ask why. He simply smiled, as though accepting the statement as a truth deserving respect. Holly is terrible at ignoring people who look sad. She gets that from her dad. Audrey nodded faintly and looked down at her cup. The steam rose gently, like a breath in the cold. Across from her, Ryan wiped a smear of chocolate from Holly's chin with a tissue. He laughed at something she whispered, leaning down to hear her better. Audrey realized she was watching them, not out of curiosity, but because of something quieter, something closer to longing. There was nothing performative about Ryan, no forced cheer, only steady warmth. He seemed like the kind of person who took whatever he had and turned it into enough. The soft table lamp cast a glow on his face. The strands of light brown hair glimmered against the warm light. In that moment, he looked like he belonged to a peaceful story she had forgotten how to read. Holly turned to her, tilting her head like a tiny interviewer. "Do you have a Christmas tree?" Audrey blinked. "A Christmas tree? I only have the one at the office. Not sure it counts." Ryan looked at her gently. "Every tree counts, as long as someone looks at it with belief." There was something in his tone, simple, humble, sincere, that touched a tender place she thought she had locked away long ago. And for the first time in many years, she smiled. Not the polite smile she used in boardrooms or in front of interview cameras, but a real one. Small, fragile, honest. Holly beamed as if she had just won the greatest victory of her life. "You look prettier when you smile." Audrey let out a quiet laugh. "I'll try to remember that." They sat like that for a long while, talking, sipping cocoa, watching the fire dance. Ryan didn't ask what she did for a living. Holly didn't ask why she was sad. And Audrey didn't ask why two people with so little warmth to spare had chosen to share it with a stranger. But something inside her, something frozen for far too long, began to move. She still didn't know their full names, but she knew this night would stay with her, perhaps longer than any gift ever could. The living room was quiet, with only the ticking of the clock and the occasional rustle of turning pages. Ryan sat cross-legged on the rug. Outside, snow was beginning to gather along the railing of the small balcony. Inside it was warm, filled with the scent of cinnamon and printer ink. He was working late again. He was preparing a proposal for an interactive children's theater program he hoped to launch in the new year. The idea came from Holly, from her vivid imagination, from the way stories could make her eyes light up as though the world still held something good waiting ahead. He wanted to create something that made children feel seen. While digging through old materials and searching for more inspiration, Ryan pulled out one of the last storage boxes that had belonged to his mother, who had passed away 4 years earlier. She had been a social worker who regularly took in children for temporary foster care. Ryan remembered scattered fragments, names, quiet faces, short visits of children who stayed in their small home for only a few days. As he searched the folders, a thin manila file caught his attention. It was much older than the rest. Its edges were soft, yellowed. A rusty paperclip held several pages together. Typed in faint ink on the top page were the words, "Audrey, Temporary Care, December 1999. Ryan froze. He sat upright, fingers trembling slightly as he opened the folder. Inside was a black and white school photo. A girl around 9, with dark brown hair, large, tired eyes, a face difficult to read. But beneath the calm expression was sadness, some quiet form of self-protection that only appears in children who have long learned not to expect anything. Then the memories flooded back. He had been 9 that winter. His mother brought home a girl who stayed for a week. She was quiet, withdrawn, always looking out the window, her hands gripping a long red scarf. Ryan remembered how he'd felt, curious, nervous. One night, he drew a reindeer on the back of a grocery list. Wobbly legs, crooked antlers, an oversized red nose. He colored it in, then slipped it under her door. The next morning, he saw the drawing on top of her suitcase. When she hugged him goodbye, she cried, but said nothing. And now, after all these years, that little girl had a full name. Audrey Whitestone. The very same woman who had sat alone on the park bench the previous week. The woman who now wore elegant wool coats and spoke with quiet authority, but whose eyes, at times, still carried a loneliness sharp enough to sting. 2 days later, Ryan texted her to ask if she'd like to get coffee. He didn't say why. They met at a small cafe tucked along the main street, one he loved. Wooden tables, soft jazz, walls lined with old books, the kind of place that felt warm and safe, like a shelter in winter. Ryan arrived early and chose a quiet corner table for them. When Audrey walked in, tall, composed, snow melting lightly on her shoulders, he greeted her with a smile softer than usual. After they ordered, Ryan reached into his pocket, then gently placed the folder on the table. Audrey looked at it, then at him. He spoke softly. "Do you remember a small house outside the city, December 1999? She didn't answer. He opened the folder and slid the photo toward her. "I think we met before," he said. "You stayed with us for a week. I drew you a reindeer." Audrey didn't move at first. Then her eyes dropped to the photograph, skimmed over the file, and finally settled on the cup of coffee in front of her. Silence. At last, she whispered, "I kept that drawing for years, folded it so many times it tore." She exhaled a small breath, almost a laugh. "I lost it when I moved into my first apartment. I looked everywhere." Ryan smiled gently. "I was a terrible artist back then." "No," she said, her voice catching. "It was the only thing that made me feel like I wasn't invisible." She looked up at him, and the practiced mask she wore every day slipped just a little. "You told me I deserved Christmas. I never forgot that." Ryan nodded. "You did. You still do." The spoon in her hand tapped once against the cup, then fell silent. No dramatic tears, no grand gestures, just a profound stillness, as though something inside her had finally been set back into place. And for the first time, Audrey looked at Ryan not simply as a kind stranger or the man who had offered her cocoa and a peaceful night, but as someone who had unknowingly saved a small part of her long ago and had just given it back to her. But there was still distance between them, an invisible distance. Audrey didn't know how to tell Ryan about the fear simmering inside her. The fear that if she let him into her life, truly let him in, everything she had built could collapse. That she would become fragile. That she would become that 9-year-old girl again, waiting and being left behind. That night, she stood before the mirror in her penthouse, alone in the vast space with the city glowing behind her. The lights from the buildings shimmered like distant stars. "Why am I afraid?" she whispered to her reflection. But she knew the answer. Because everyone she had let into her heart had left. Because success was the only thing that could not abandon her. Or so she had once believed. Ryan had nights like that too. Nights when he woke at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was fooling himself. He was a single father. He freelanced in stage design with an unstable income. He lived in a small apartment with a 1-meter Christmas tree. He was not the kind of man a CEO was supposed to love. But then he remembered how Audrey looked at Holly. He remembered her smile when Holly talked about the cardboard star. He remembered how her voice softened when she said, "It's been a long time since anyone poured something warm for me." And he understood something. Audrey didn't need a successful man. She needed someone who saw her, truly saw her. But how could he be sure he was enough? Holly was the first to notice. "Daddy loves Miss Audrey, right?" Ryan froze at the sink, sponge still in hand. "How do you know?" "Because you smile more when you talk about her. And you always check your phone." Ryan turned to look at his daughter. She was sitting on the floor with a coloring book, but her eyes were on him with that strange, serious, yet mischievous look children get when they believe they've uncovered the family's biggest secret. Do you like her? He asked quietly. Holly nodded hard. She needs you. And you need her. I can see it. From the mouth of a child, the truth is always the simplest. The faint echo of the theater still lingered in Ryan's ears. The dress rehearsal for the children's play had just ended, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to exhale. Slowly. Parents clapped. Children giggled. Volunteers beamed with pride. Ryan stood at the edge of the stage, his hair slightly tousled after the hectic day, his gray sweater dusted with stray glitter from a wandering prop. He was tired, but his eyes were bright. It had worked. Months of quiet labor. Late nights stitching scenes together between Holly's bedtime stories. Every line of the script built from kindness and wonder. The very things he once longed for when he was a child. The cast consisted of local kids, some from orphanages, some with language difficulties, some simply overlooked in overcrowded classrooms. But tonight, every single one of them had sung, danced, and shone. Ryan smiled the whole way home, until the next morning. He saw the post before he finished his tea. An anonymous blog entry was spreading fast. Accusations, comparisons, screenshots. The tone was venomous, yet polished, asserting that Ryan's script bore suspicious resemblance to an obscure children's play from 3 years earlier. The anonymous writer, clearly someone with internal access, hinted that Ryan had repackaged an old idea under the guise of charity. The post circulated quickly across local networks. It was all smoke and mirrors, selectively cropped words, deliberately placed side-by-side graphics, photos pulled out of context. But it was enough to stir suspicion. By afternoon, the main sponsor announced they were freezing funding, pending a full review. Some collaborators grew distant. One withdrew entirely. Ryan stared at his phone, numb. He knew who wrote it. A former collaborator he had severed ties with. Talented, but unstable and dishonest. Ryan had chosen integrity over popularity, and now that choice was coming back for payment. But he didn't go online to defend himself. He didn't fall apart. He simply went back to work, quietly printing handouts for the children who would arrive the next day. His fingers trembled slightly as he stapled the corners, as if holding on to a concrete task was the only way to keep from being swept away by the rising tide of helplessness. Meanwhile, in a quieter office across the city, Holly sat cross-legged in Audrey's workspace. She had arrived after school with a handmade holiday card, bursting with glitter glue explosions of joy. Sipping juice from a paper cup, Holly suddenly looked up and said, as if remarking on the weather, "Did you know people are saying my dad stole a play?" Audrey froze. "Where did you hear that?" she asked, trying to sound calm. Too calm. "Some kids at school saw it on their parents' phones," Holly said, biting her straw. "But I told them they were wrong. My dad would never steal. Dad even told me I'm not allowed to bring pencils home from school if they're not mine." That was enough. Audrey didn't say anything more to Holly. She only gave her a faint smile and handed her a second cookie, as if to keep the room warm. That evening, she called her legal team. Within 24 hours, Whitestone Enterprises issued an official statement. The document was professionally crafted and meticulous, complete with evidence of Ryan's original drafts, timestamps, witnesses, submission records. It laid out a full digital trail of his project development, including planning materials and correspondence with educators. The anonymous author was exposed. A cease and desist letter was sent. A lawsuit followed. The reaction spread like an avalanche. The next morning, the sponsor emailed Ryan. Their tone was apologetic, almost remorseful. They reinstated funding and offered additional promotional support. "We believe in your vision," they wrote. Ryan stared at the screen, then checked his phone. Still nothing from Audrey. He called her. When she picked up, his own voice sounded too steady, as if the slightest tremor might break everything. "Ryan, did you do something?" he asked quietly. "I did what anyone should do," she replied, "for someone who deserves better." Silence. Then his voice cracked, soft, raw, honest, too fast for him to catch. "I'm not used to being protected." Audrey went still. "I said the same thing once," she answered, "but no one should get used to being alone." Ryan swallowed hard. His eyes stung. Not from fear, not from injustice, but from the dizzying relief of being seen, being shielded, without having to beg for it. But Ryan didn't know that when the call ended, Audrey was trembling too. She sat alone in her vast office, staring out at the city through tall glass windows. Outside, Minneapolis glittered under the night lights. Inside, something in her chest had just cracked, not in a loud, painful way, but in the kind that left a person utterly still. She had done the right thing. She knew that. But now, the boundary between someone familiar and someone important had begun to blur, like the outline of a painting softened under falling snow. And that frightened her more than any lawsuit ever could. Because this time, she couldn't control the outcome. This time, what she was risking was her heart. It started with a question. An innocent classroom conversation about family trees, holiday plans, and who would be visiting whom for Christmas. Holly had smiled and talked about decorating the little tree she shared with her dad, how she and her father baked star-shaped and snowman-shaped cookies. Then someone asked, "Where's your mom?" When Holly shrugged and said she didn't have one, giggles began to spread like a cold draft. A boy leaned in with a cruel smirk. "So your dad just made you up?" Another chimed in, "Maybe your mom saw you and ran away." The teacher quickly shut them down, but the wound had already carved itself deep into Holly's chest. That afternoon, Ryan came home from a meeting and immediately sensed the apartment was too quiet. The front door was still locked, but Holly's shoes were not in their usual spot. He checked every room, every closet. Then his voice broke out in panic. "Holly?" No answer. He ran downstairs, asked neighbors, called the parents of Holly's classmates. Nobody had seen her. His hands trembled as he dialed the police, his heart pounding painfully up into his throat. Tears came fast and hot. Without thinking, he called Audrey. She picked up on the first ring. "Ryan!" "Holly is missing," he gasped. I don't know where she is. She's not here." Minutes later, Audrey was already in her car. She didn't ask what Holly was wearing or how long she'd been gone. She knew. "I think I know where she went," she said. Snow was falling softly, just like that night. The park was empty, blanketed in white, the lake frozen over once more. And there, on the same stone bench where everything had begun, sat a small figure curled up in her too-thin jacket. Holly was hunched over, tiny knees pulled to her chest. Her knit hat had slipped over one eye. Her gloves were soaked, her cheeks bright red, and her breath puffed out in soft clouds. Ryan approached slowly. "Hey, sweetheart." Holly looked up. Her bottom lip trembled violently. "I'm sorry." Ryan sat down beside her. "Why did you come here?" Holly glanced at the bench, then the empty space beside it. "I wanted to see if someone was still waiting here." "You did that?" Ryan's voice tightened. "She cried that day," Holly whispered, "and I thought maybe, if I waited here, someone would come." Ryan's throat constricted. He remembered himself at her age, sitting in the cold, watching other children get picked up, wondering what made him less worthy of being chosen. The pain of waiting like that had never truly left him. He reached out, pulled Holly into his arms, wrapped his coat around her, holding her tight. "I'm here," he said, his voice thick. "And Audrey is looking everywhere for you. Let's go home, okay?" "Okay." Holly pressed her face against Ryan's chest and nodded. "I didn't mean to scare you. I just wanted to understand." Back at Ryan's apartment, Audrey knelt down, arms open, her face wet with tears. Holly ran into her embrace. "I'm sorry, Miss Audrey." Audrey held her tight, her hands trembling as she kissed Holly's forehead again and again. "You're safe. That's all that matters." Ryan stood at the doorway watching them. The weight of the past pressed heavily against his chest. But for the first time, it felt like that past had found a place to rest, a place soft enough to lay it down. Holly looked up at Audrey, still sniffling. "Miss Audrey?" Audrey let out a tearful laugh. "Yes, sweetheart?" "You came for me." Audrey lowered herself to eye level. "Always." That night, the snow continued to fall. But inside, warmth had returned. Not just in blankets and cocoa, but in something deeper. For Ryan, who once waited in vain, and for Holly, who once believed she had no one, the stone bench in the snow had finally closed a circle. And in the soft glow of Christmas lights, something like healing began to bloom. But one question remained, hanging tender and uncertain in the space between Audrey and Ryan. A question neither of them dared touch. Was this only temporary? Or was this forever? The apartment carried a faint scent of cinnamon and orange. Ryan had just finished warming a pot of apple cider, while Holly was carefully untangling a strand of twisted tinsel on the floor, her tongue sticking out in concentration. Their mini Christmas tree, a reused one from many years before, stood in the corner, leaning slightly to one side as though it, too, was tired after a long winter. "Careful with the lights, sweetheart," Ryan called softly from the kitchen. "They're older than you are." Holly giggled, holding up a bunch of glowing red and green lights, the cord coiled into a tangled knot. "I think they're alive. They don't want to be tamed." Ryan laughed, stepping into the living room, drying his hands with a towel. The apartment was modest, but cozy, filled with handmade decorations and a calm, genuine happiness. Then the doorbell rang. Both of them froze. It was Christmas Eve, and they weren't expecting anyone. Holly jumped up, sprinting toward the door. Maybe Santa came early. Ryan found it amusing but was just as curious, so he followed. When he opened the door, he froze, for just a second. Audrey stood there. Her black coat was dusted with snow, her breath fogging in the cold. In her arms was a small but fresh Christmas tree, wrapped with twinkling lights. It leaned a little, imperfect, but strangely sincere. Her gloves didn't match, clearly pulled on in a hurry. And she looked hesitant, as if unsure whether she was stepping too far. "I thought," she said, her voice hoarse from the wind, "maybe your tree could use a bit of support." Holly's eyes lit up like the lights on the tree. "You brought reinforcements," Audrey laughed. And for the first time, that laugh wasn't restrained. Holly stepped forward, looking up at Audrey with the confidence of a child who understands exactly what matters most in life. "Miss Audrey," she said, "maybe you don't need to borrow any more. You can just stay." Audrey blinked. The words hit something deep inside her. Past the years of board meetings, tailored suits, and quiet holidays. Past the little girl she once was, the one who had always been too afraid to ask someone to stay. She looked at Ryan. He met her gaze, and something passed between them with no need for words. A recognition. an understanding, perhaps even a soft kind of permission. His smile softened, his voice low. "Come in. We were just about to start the lights." He stepped aside, as if clearing a path not just for her to enter the room, but to enter something larger, warmer. Audrey stepped in and gently placed her tree next to theirs. "It's not much," she said, glancing at their worn ornaments, "but I thought maybe it would make Christmas feel a little more real." Holly looked between the two trees, then nodded with adorable seriousness. "Now it's a forest." They spent the next hour decorating both trees. Holly told Audrey the story behind each ornament: a candy cane from last year, a star made from popsicle sticks, a snowflake she insisted looked like a spaceship. Ryan made hot cocoa for the three of them, and Audrey accepted her cup with a quiet smile. She sat close, but not too close, beside Ryan, their shoulders almost touching, as if one more breath would erase the distance entirely. And when Holly curled under a blanket at the end of the evening, yawning as she whispered, "This is the best Christmas ever." No adult said a word. They didn't need to. Outside, the snow continued falling, soft and endless. Inside, the warmth came not only from the fire, the cocoa, or the lights, but from something quieter, steadier. Presence. There were no declarations, no grand promises, just a woman who once sat alone on a cold metal bench with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, now sitting beside a man who once waited in silence, and a little girl who had given her a place to belong. And in that peaceful, ordinary room, a feeling had begun to deepen. But there was still one more moment. A moment meant only for Ryan and Audrey. When Holly was asleep, bundled in a blanket on the small sofa, the two of them sat together by the fireplace. The flames danced across their faces, casting soft shadows like unspoken truths. "I'm scared," Audrey whispered, still not looking at him. "Scared of this." "Scared of what?" Ryan asked gently. "Scared to believe in it. Scared to let it be real. Scared that if I allow myself to want this, it will disappear." Ryan was quiet for a long time, as if choosing words that were honest without breaking anything fragile. "I'm scared too," he said. "Every day." Audrey turned to him, slightly startled. "I'm scared I'm not enough. That you deserve someone. More. Someone who isn't a single dad living in a rented apartment with a 1-meter tree." Audrey smiled through her tears. "You don't understand, do you? I don't need someone more. I need someone who sees me." She reached out, weaving her fingers with his. "And you see me, Ryan. From the very beginning." He squeezed her hand, as if that was the only way to keep this delicate thing from slipping away. "Then, let's be scared together?" She nodded, very softly. "Together." And in the glow of the fire, two people who once believed they had to be strong alone learned the simplest, hardest truth: that sometimes the greatest strength is allowing yourself to be loved. The auditorium lights dimmed into a soft golden hue, spreading a gentle stillness across the crowd. Families squeezed together in their seats, coats folded neatly on their laps, phones silenced, eyes fixed on the small wooden stage framed by string lights and handmade paper snowflakes. Outside, the snow continued falling, slow and quiet. But inside, there was warmth, a bubbling energy of something about to begin. Audrey sat near the front row. Around her were unfamiliar faces, and yet she felt something equally unfamiliar: comfort. In her hands was the evening's program, and printed near the end was the title of the final act, The Boy and the Borrowed Light, written and directed by Ryan Halbrook, starring Holly Halbrook. She smiled before she even realized she was smiling. Backstage, Ryan stood in the darkness behind the curtain. His headset sat slightly askew, and a bundle of clipboards was clutched in his hand. His gray sweater was dusted with flour and glitter from days of preparation, but his eyes were bright, focused, alive. He whispered encouragement as the children lined up. He leaned down to straighten a crooked halo on a little boy, smoothed the back of a girl's wrinkled robe. Then he knelt and took Holly's hands in his. "You're ready," he said softly. Holly nodded. "What if I forget my lines, Daddy?" "Then you smile and borrow a little light from someone in the audience. You'll know who it is." Holly grinned. The curtain opened. The stage was built from painted cardboard trees, and glowing lanterns hung from fishing line. Holly stepped out, playing the central role, a little girl searching for the light she had lost. The scenes unfolded with a charming simplicity. The girl wandered through shadows, meeting characters who each offered her a fragment of their own light, kindness, stories, laughter, until finally, near the end, she stood alone again. A single spotlight found Holly at center stage. She looked so small beneath it, her voice steady but tender. "When I get lost in the dark," she said, pausing just long enough, "I can borrow someone's light until mine shines again." Silence swept the room. Not the kind born from awkwardness or mistakes. The kind born from truth. Every adult in the room went still. Some reached for tissues. Others placed a hand over their chest, as if their hearts needed steadying. Audrey didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the little girl whose words had pierced through every wall it had taken her years to build. She didn't cry, but something inside her, something old and tightly guarded, began to shift. She looked toward the wings, where Ryan stood just out of sight. His arms were loosely folded, watching not just the play, but his daughter. And this moment, their moment. He didn't realize Audrey was looking at him. He was too immersed in the children's world, in their voices, in the hush of belief filling the room. He glowed, not from stage lights, not from anything flashy, but from presence. Quiet, steady, a kind of enduring grace that made people want to believe. Audrey felt it as clearly as if she were touching the warmth of a flame. Ryan had always been borrowed light. From the very beginning. From the snow-covered bench. From the night she opened her door. From the way he never pushed, never demanded more, never questioned her hesitation. He simply stayed, offering enough safety for her to see. The applause erupted like snowfall. Soft at first, then thick and thunderous. Holly bowed. The curtain lowered. The lights came back on. The room filled with joy. But Audrey remained still. That final line echoed in her mind. She didn't rush backstage. She sat in the quiet glow after the performance, her fingers still gripping the now crumpled program, as if she needed something to anchor her. Somewhere inside her, a promise was forming. Not loud, not hurried, not even spoken. Just a silent vow. That light, the one she once borrowed, would never again be taken for granted. The snow had softened by the time they reached the park, falling now in slow, lazy flakes that shimmered under the faint glow of Christmas lights. Everything was quiet, just like that night, when the world had felt too cold and too wide, and only one small voice had pierced through the silence. Audrey slowed as they approached the bench. The same bench, weathered, familiar, covered in a thin white layer of snow. Ryan glanced at her, his breath curling in the air. He didn't say anything. He simply brushed the snow off and sat down first. Holly climbed up beside him, her legs dangling off the edge. Audrey followed. Ryan reached into a canvas tote bag and pulled out a silver thermos. The scent of cocoa rose as he poured the warm drink into 3 mismatched cups, the kind he always carried just in case. He handed one to Audrey, one to Holly, and kept the last for himself. Holly pulled something out from inside her coat, a folded piece of cardstock, its edges still damp with glitter glue. She opened it carefully and held it up. On the front was a child's drawing, 3 stick figures sitting on a bench beneath twinkling lights. A tall figure in a long coat with sad eyes, a woman with brown blonde hair offering a cookie, and a little girl in a bare-eared hat, grinning wide. "That's you," Holly said, pointing to the middle. "And that's my dad and me, the first time we met." Audrey took the card gently, a tightness forming in her chest. Holly leaned against her arm. "I'm glad you borrowed my dad that day." Ryan watched the two of them, his smile soft and quiet. He took a sip from his cup, his hair falling slightly over one eye. The streetlight behind them cast a glow on his face, as if turning a memory into something visible. Audrey set the card on her lap and looked at him. Then she reached out and took Ryan's hand in hers. His fingers curled around hers instinctively. No hesitation. They didn't need declarations, no grand speeches, no perfect moment framed by music or sparkle. Just this: a bench, a little girl, and a beginning. Audrey turned to Holly and said, "You were right, you know." Holly tilted her head. "About what?" "About that day, when you said I could borrow your dad." Holly smiled as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. Audrey looked back at Ryan, her voice quiet but certain. "I'm not borrowing anymore. I'm staying." Ryan didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. He simply smiled, then gently rested Audrey's head on his shoulder, letting the warmth between them fill the silent space. The space where loneliness had lived for far too long. And beneath the soft snow and string lights, with Coco warming their hands and an entire history behind them, they sat together. A woman who once waited on a bench and found nothing. A man who gave without ever asking for anything in return. And a little girl who saw sadness and offered hope. Together. Not perfect, but whole. But there was one more moment. A moment that belonged only to Audrey. After Holly fell asleep against Ryan's shoulder, Audrey lifted her gaze to the night sky. The snow was still falling, gentle and endless. And for the first time since she was 9 years old, Audrey no longer felt like a child waiting for someone to choose her. Because she had chosen. She had chosen this small, messy, imperfect family. And they had chosen her. 1 year later, Loring Park was still the same, blanketed in snow, quiet, stretching out as if it had no end. But this time, no one was sitting there alone. Audrey, Ryan, and Holly stood beside the stone bench, looking at it the way one would look at an exhibit in a museum. Something that once held pain, then joy, and now only held memory. Holly was a little older now. Her hair was longer, her smile more confident. She held a new card in her hands, another drawing, and this time there were 4 stick figures. "This is us," she said, pointing to the picture. "And this is the 4th person." Audrey and Ryan exchanged a look. "The 4th person?" Audrey asked softly. Holly nodded, serious enough to make even adults hold their breath. "For the baby that's coming. Dad told me already." Ryan burst into a laugh, cheeks flushing. We didn't." Audrey smiled, placing a hand on her belly, still flat, still unchanged, still holding a secret only she and her doctor knew. "Not yet," she said gently, "but soon." Ryan stared at her, eyes wide. You're serious." Audrey nodded, her eyes shimmering. Ryan pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, as if letting go for even one heartbeat would make her disappear. Holly jumped up and down, cheering with pure joy. I knew it! I knew it! I knew it! Then they sat on that bench one last time, together, as a family. And as the snow drifted down around them, Audrey suddenly realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not afraid to love. Not afraid to lose. Not afraid to let herself be seen. Because sometimes, the miracle isn't in finding a family. The miracle is realizing you had one all along. You just needed the courage to stay. Thank you for listening to Don't Cry, Miss. You Can Borrow My Dad. A quiet journey of healing that began with a child's innocent offer and blossomed into a small, imperfect, but complete family. If this story touched something in your heart, even for a moment, please subscribe and tap the bell to support stories that stir the soul. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue bringing you honest stories, the kind that linger long after they end. See you in the next story, where emotions will speak louder than words.